You guys, it is like 110 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori, and today we are going to be talking about all of the books I read in the month of June, and I have some amazing recommendations for you guys. I read so many great books this month, and I am so excited to talk about it. This month I participated in a Dungeons and Book Dragons themed readathon that was designed by my incredibly creative friend Leah from the Instagram account Leah Reads Stuff. You can find that down in the description. And that was so much fun. I got to read a bunch of books that I was planning on. I threw in a couple of completely out of left field surprise books, which I'm excited to talk to you guys about. And while I am definitely ready to mood read my way through July, we had a great time. We had a readathon event in my Discord, and it was just a good old time. So let's start off with a new series that I started in June that I've been planning on reading for a while, and we will be doing a discussion of this book over on my friend Samwise's channel in the next week or two, and I'm super excited to finally have begun this series, and that is the Lycanius trilogy with book 1, The Shadow of What Was Lost. Now this book, I was really kind of 50-50 on where I was going to land with this book, because it does begin with that sort of chosen one, hero's journey vibe, and it is definitely a debut book. It is not perfect by any means. There are some things about it that felt a little bit clunky in terms of the writing style and the structure and things like that, but I ended up really enjoying this story. And I think what I loved about it the most is the concepts and the magic that James Islington is playing with in this book is so incredibly fascinating. That was the aspect of the book that had me completely gripped and really invested in where this was going to go. I wanted answers. I wanted to know where we were going to go with all of this and how the magic was going to be revealed throughout the story. And obviously this is just book 1, so I have a lot of reveals left to go through the trilogy. But the other thing that he's really good at is creating young friendships with his characters that not only feel very organic, they feel very comfortable. They feel like the kind of relationships that are actually role modeling some healthy behaviors for characters that are coming of age. Coming of age is such a huge fantasy trope, and so young characters are a dime a dozen within fantasy. But so often I feel like the miscommunication and the getting angry about nothing for no reason is so prevalent in so many of those books that it was really refreshing to read a story where these young characters really actually have each other's backs, and they're not taking every little thing personally. They're recognizing that their paths may diverge, and if they do, that might just be how it has to be, and they support each other, and they recognize that they have different goals, or not even goals, but different destinies, if you want to put it that way. And it is really interesting because the magic system in this book does not hold your hand. James Islington definitely does not give you too many hints. He kind of throws you into the middle of everything that's going on, and you just have to kind of let go of that white-knuckled grip on I need to know what is happening at every moment, and just sort of let yourself be carried along by the current of this story. Now, as you can see, this book is quite a chunk, and I do feel like it would have benefited from being shortened up a little bit. I could see like 150 to 200 pages of this being condensed down, which is, I feel like, not uncommon at all for a debut novel in fantasy. And the middle part did feel a little bit slow compared to the beginning setup and the end kind of beginning resolution. And that was probably the hardest part for me, along with some of the story structure things. I had a little bit of a hard time with the way certain things were set up and how they were being utilized, especially in the later part of the book with some of the bigger combat situations. There were some things that just felt a little off. But for a debut novel, what excites me about this series so much is just It's very clear to me that Islington has some really cool ideas, and I cannot wait to see how he resolves them through the next 2 books, and how these character relationships are going to continue to build and grow. That's what really excites me about this book, and I think for a debut fantasy novel, it honestly has so much to offer, especially since at the very beginning, when you start off and you're like, oh, this is a very familiar hero's journey, we're gonna take forever to get through this first part where we're setting everything up and the characters in this like magic school and whatever. And Islington actually really surprised me with that, because he does not take forever to get the ball rolling in this story, which I also think was a huge point in this book's favor as I was reading. Really enjoyed this. I'm looking forward to reading book 2 in the near future and finishing the trilogy and seeing how all of these incredibly fascinating and fresh ideas get resolved in the rest of the story. Moving on to a second fantasy series that I started last month, I read The King's Blood by Daniel Abraham. This is book 2 in his Dagger and Coin series, and we just did a discussion. When this video comes out, we will have just done the discussion over on my friend Alan from the Library of Alexandria's channel, so I will link that also down in the description below if you want to go watch. This book, Abraham does not waste any time in his series ramping up the tension and the conflict and just grabbing the reader by the throat and being like, you have no idea what's going to happen next. The tension in this series. I love the way that Daniel Abraham writes his characters, and I know I said this in my review of The Dragon's Path, book 1 as well, but the thing that I can always count on reading a Daniel Abraham novel, and this was true of Long Price Quartet and now this series, these characters feel so real. They feel so organic. They feel like they genuinely could exist in a history of another world. I think the way that he does that is really gives them the flawed human, like, doesn't always fit into the hero or the villain box. It is just, these are the characters, the people that exist within this world, and here are the mistakes and the decisions that they make. And we just are invited to come along for that story, to follow the character journeys, and to make up our own decisions about how we feel about them, which is so incredibly refreshing, because I feel like a lot of more modern fantasy books do try to kind of lead you through the story and give you a little nudge in the direction of here's how you should feel about this character or the decisions that they're making. And I really appreciate that Daniel Abraham writes in a way that invites you into the conversation, invites you to look at all of the angles, it invites you to consider the perspectives of multiple people surrounding the conflict that's going on in this story, and make up your own mind and really figure out how you feel on your own. He does not handhold you at all as a reader in that way, which is something I personally really enjoy in fantasy. This is incredibly political. The second book just takes everything we set up in book 1 and ramps it up to 11. There's so much conflict, there's so much tension, there's a lot of things building, and you can kind of see the growing dread what direction we're heading on the larger scale of things, and it's genuinely terrifying because Daniel Abraham knows how to create a magic system, you guys, that will absolutely just chill you. There are some aspects to this magic system that are just as horrifying as they were in the magic system of Long Price Quartet, and there are some things in this book, it wasn't like a full gung-ho 5 stars for me, just because there were a few things in this book that subjectively I did not resonate with very well, and he makes some decisions that I think are incredibly bold and just add to the level of, oh my gosh, what is happening that is going on in this series as a reader. But all of the swerves and all of the surprises and twists that he throws at you in this series don't feel like they don't make sense. They don't feel like they're gratuitous. It's genuine. And that is something that I think is really difficult to pull off as an author. But when you can do it and do it well, it's such a satisfying reading experience. So I am now 2 books into the series, and there are some things, the way that this book ended just sort of has me a little bit stressed. I'm not gonna lie, because some things happened that I can't talk about because that would be spoilers, but I'm in an uncomfortable place at the end of this book, and I have some predictions about where the series is gonna go that I think I'm really gonna enjoy, and I almost think if it goes that way that I will end up liking the back half of this series just incredibly much, which is exciting. I'm looking forward to that. Moving on to book 3, The Tyrant's Law, next month. And I'm really looking forward to it, you guys. I'm really excited to see where we're gonna go in this kind of hinge novel in the middle of this series. It's gonna be a doozy. Like, Daniel Abraham is not the kind of author who is just going to kind of slowly trickle things in until this big climactic 5th book at the end of the series. He's just coming in here with a battering ram every single book. And it's going to be interesting to see how he continues to ramp that up into what is shaping up to be a really incredible finale. After those 1,200 pages of epic fantasy, I needed a little bit of a brain reset and a break, so I went back to some Japanese translated healing fiction with The Cat Who Saved Books by Sosuke Natsukawa. This was such an interesting read, and I have really fallen in love with this kind of simple, straightforward, almost modern folktale style of storytelling that I'm finding in a lot of the translated Japanese novels that I've read. And the opening chapter of this book follows a young man who is attending his grandfather's funeral, and this is a family member that means a lot to him, that has been a huge influence in his life. His grandfather owned a bookstore, a small bookstore that was just kind of hanging on by a thread, but it was curated with such love and care and an appreciation of great stories. And that opening chapter was so powerful. It was such a huge impact. And even without my recent experience of losing my own grandfather, I still feel like that opening chapter was just objectively brilliant. I absolutely loved it. It hit me, punched me right in the heart, and I was like, oh wow, this is so well worded. It so beautifully understands the concept of grieving for someone that's been a pillar in your life without going overboard. It's only a couple of pages, but every single word on those pages was perfect, and it absolutely did everything it needed to do to pull me into that story and make me invested in what was going to happen next. Now, the basic premise of this story is this young man isn't really sure where his life is going to go after this. He's still in high school, but he doesn't know if he's going to stay at the bookstore and take care of it himself, or if he's going to go live with his aunt and do something completely different with his life. And as he's trying to figure this out, a magical cat shows up in the bookstore and tells him that he's needed, that the cat needs his help to go save some books. And what follows is a kind of episodic, like, moral lessons sort of story structure, which honestly, like, there were aspects of that I still found really impactful and really powerful, but I almost wish that it had been more of a just slice of life instead of moving into that sort of magical realism aspect of the story. I would have liked it if we had just stayed in that bookstore with this young man and met his friends and kind of taken out the magical side of it, which sounds kind of weird because that's kind of the whole point of the book, but that prologue and that opening chapter was just so powerful that I kind of wanted to stay there in that space. However, there was a quote in this book that I really wanted to read you guys because I literally want to frame this and put it on my wall. It is all very well to read a book, but when you've finished, it's time to set foot in the world. And that was one of the wise sayings by the main character's grandfather. And there were a couple of lines in this book that really are still just kind of sitting in my heart. Despite my experience with the overall story not being quite as much as I was hoping for, there were a couple of lines in here that are quotes that I would love to just plaster all over my walls. Now, after I finished that book, I needed even more of a brain reset because The Cat Who Saved Books kind of started that process but didn't fully complete it for me. So I decided to go to my Kindle, and I decided to just read the first book that showed up in my library, which would have been the last thing that I purchased. And I had completely forgotten what that was because it's been a couple of months and I sometimes have the brain of a goldfish about these things. So I opened my Kindle and it was Mooncalled by Patricia Briggs, which I had purchased due to some conversations I'd had with my good friend Casey over at Bookishly Bookish. And she knew that I was struggling with some aspects of Dresden, but I was really feeling that sort of urban fantasy vibe. And so she had said, hey, well, you could always try some other urban fantasy and just see what you think of it. And I know you like vampires and werewolves, so here you go. Honestly, I was feeling a little hesitant about reading it just because of the cover. I was like, okay, I know what kind of book this is going to be, right? This book was such a surprise, you guys. There were definitely things about it that were cringy, that made me roll my eyes, but overall, I also found a lot of things in this story that I really enjoyed. It definitely has that kind of controlling, male-dominated culture within the werewolf packs. But what I loved about it was that Mercy Thompson, who's the main character, like, really doesn't take crap about it from anybody. She is her own woman, and, like, you can try to pin her down, but it's not going to work. And so I really appreciated that that conversation was happening with a main character who is very independent and is very strong, but also recognizes when she needs to lean on other people, which honestly is so rare in books like this. So there is an aspect of romance to this, but it's not like the focal point of the story, which I also really liked. And I will admit to being very gun-shy about stories that are about werewolves that include the words like alpha in the back of the synopsis. But I will say that this one really pleasantly surprised me, and I think that Patricia Briggs used a lot of that kind of concept without taking it into the horrifically cringy, horrible, like, Twilight fanfiction realm. I was really pleasantly surprised by this. I was really pleasantly surprised, and I do intend to continue the series. And can I just say that after reading Dresden, which I like a lot of things about Dresden, there's also a lot of things that I'm really not liking about Dresden. It was so refreshing to read from a female character's perspective, I have to say. It was so refreshing. And I actually think that this book probably got an extra half star or star from me simply because I was also reading Dresden at the time, and it was so refreshing to, like, see characters described in a way that wasn't purely physical. And even the characters, the male characters that Mercy might be attracted to, she's still not going into it describing them in a way that's really cringy and objectifying, which I just really appreciate. So yeah, I guess I'm reading Patricia Briggs now, which was not on anybody's bingo card for 2026, but I'm not mad about it, and I'm looking forward to seeing where the story goes. And it's different enough from what I've been reading that I think it was just a pleasant reprieve from the epic fantasy and also from some of the content that I didn't like in Dresden. Next up, The Last Contract of Isako. This is a new release from Fonda Lee, who's the author of the Greenbone Saga, which I read a couple of years ago and really, really loved pretty much the whole thing with some minor caveats. This one has probably been my biggest, most anticipated read of 2026. I went to Barnes & Noble to purchase this book the day it came out, which I don't do. I rarely do that anymore. And it was so fun. I was so excited to get to this. And this is a science fiction story that has been kind of labeled as sort of corporate samurai. It's a sci-fi. It's very some dystopian vibes in here. And it's almost like a super on steroids adult version of, like, The Giver by Lois Lowry in some ways, which I really appreciated. with a little bit of that Greenbone Saga flair thrown in. It's been really interesting to see the commentary around this book after it came out, because I think a lot of people have been expressing their frustration that this book was labeled as corporate samurai style sci-fi. And I think that's really interesting because I don't know what people's expectations were based on that description, but I almost feel like that was a problem with the expectations more than the book. Because if you really know the culture of the samurai and the code of honor that they were bound to, and their complete and utter loyalty to their lord, if we're going back to like feudal Japan samurai, this book completely fits that style of marketing. And I think it's interesting. I don't know what people were expecting from this, if they were expecting like a bloodbath through the entire thing, but that's not what samurai are. And I actually found that this does a fantastic job of digging into those aspects of samurai culture that aren't flashy swords and, you know, bloodbath kind of things, because that, again, isn't the point. And I don't know, I think the expectations surrounding this book were a little off for a lot of people in terms of them not really understanding what that actually means, and why this book, in my opinion, does such a good job of walking that line and showing what that kind of code of honor and loyalty would look like in a setting like this. My personal experience with this book, it did take me a little bit to get into it, I won't lie. The beginning felt a little bit slow, and Isako as a main character, I had a hard time resonating with her, which actually kind of surprised me. There are definitely some flavors in her character and in this book in general that reminded me a bit of the Jade War setting of the Greenbone Saga, if you've read it. So definitely it still feels very Fonda-ly in that way. As we get more and more reveals and more information about the political underpinnings of what's going on in this dystopian kind of terraforming culture, it gets more and more interesting, it gets more and more complicated, and I think Fonda-ly is really tackling a lot of morals and ethics questions in this book, and I think she does a fairly good job of just bringing her reader into that conversation and sitting us down at a table and saying, how do we feel about this? What questions should we be asking about these types of society, directions and what ifs, and how would we prevent certain things, which I personally really liked. Again, I really enjoy when an author asks me to step into a conversation and just kind of think through my own opinions on something. There were a couple of reveals in this that really did not work for me, and there were a couple of reveals that I felt like were more heavy-handed, some thematic things that were way more heavy-handed than I was hoping. And I do feel like those kind of harken back to some of the things that I didn't jive with as much in the Greenbone Saga. About halfway through the book, there is a shift in tone, I think is how I would say that without spoilers, that I feel like really opened the door on everything that was going on and gave us some new perspective on the depth of the corruption and the political maneuvering and everything that's going on in the story. So overall, I actually really enjoyed this. I think there were definitely some things about it for me that did not work as well as I was hoping that they would. But I still think it's worth a read. I don't think it's going to hit the level of Greenbone Saga for me at all, but I do think, again, that some of the expectations I feel like people had of this with that corporate samurai label were kind of show a little bit of a misunderstanding of what samurai culture actually was, and why and how that would be translated into a, futuristic epic like this. Next up, I tried a new author for the first time with Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher. This is my first ever T. Kingfisher read, and she is a author that I hadn't really ever considered, if I'm being totally honest. But again, my friend Leah, who's a big fan of T. Kingfisher, was like, hey, I think you should try Thornhedge and see what you think of it. Now, this is a tiny little fantasy book, and it is a retelling of the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale. And I love retellings that just completely turn the concept of the original fairy tale on their head. Lost Boy by Christina Henry is another one that I talk about all the time that I really love. And this one follows a fae slash like partial fae character named Toadling, who has been guarding a tower for a really, really long time, because what's in the tower needs to be kept in the tower. And the combination of just wholesome fairy tale coziness that we get with Toadling versus the bone-chilling horror that T. Kingfisher throws at us in some of the other aspects of the story is crazy. The prose is very simple, but it's very beautiful, and she explores so many aspects of humanity and the struggles that we have through these characters that was really heartwarming and really shows a deep understanding of those struggles. Beautiful, beautiful work, in my opinion. This one is definitely a book that I can see myself reading again, and because it's so short, I don't want to tell you guys too much about it, because I do think it's the kind of story that you should just read for yourself. But yeah, like, I'm not usually a fairy tale retelling type of person. I typically sort of get hands off about those because I feel like a lot of times they get turned into kind of, I don't know, just cringy, kind of shallow retellings, or they don't really do anything new and interesting with the original story. But I feel like T. Kingfisher really had me intrigued with this one, and I loved so many quotes in this story. I loved the characters so much. Toadling and one of the other characters we meet in the story are just so precious, and I love them so much. And she genuinely had my skin crawling at one point at the end of this novel, and I just think it's a really great little fantasy novella. Next up, I continued my journey with the Dresden Files with Summer Night. And not spoiling too much, because this is a book 4 in the series, Harry is dealing with the Fae Courts in this book. Now, I appreciate that, again, Jim Butcher's world building and the way that he pulls out the lore of these different mythological creatures and humanoids is brilliant, and I think that's one of the things that has kept me interested in the series despite some of the more cringy elements of the story. And Dresden as a main character, he was the hardest sell for me in this book, because he's kind of throwing himself a pretty massive pity party in the story, and it's not necessarily that I understand why, like, it doesn't come out of nowhere, but it just made him, especially like this many books in, where I'm kind of hoping to see more character growth, and I'm just feeling like we're taking steps backwards instead of moving forwards at all, was a little tricky, especially with having issues with a lot of the other aspects of the story. But where I think Butcher shines, and I think where I'm starting to understand the friends that I have that love this series, where I'm understanding the why of that, is not only the richness of the writing and the world building and the way that he's incorporating so many different types of lore in the story, but it's also Harry's relationships with the side characters, the little motley crew of friends and allies that he gathers through this series. That's where the magic of this series is, in my opinion. I loved Billy. I love Toot Toot. Toot Toot is a phenomenal little character, and I love him so much. And I think what I'm still struggling with is I want more of that. I feel like right now, those relationships and those really phenomenal side characters and their relationship to Harry is kind of the like sprinkling on the cake as opposed to the cake itself. And I kind of want that to reverse, if that makes sense. I want it to be the cake with a sprinkling of everything else, because I'm such a character nerd that I just want more characters. The other thing is, this is the first time where I feel like Harry's comments when he's describing, especially the female characters of this series, shifts away from being kind of repetitive and cringy. And I need to put a disclaimer on this. I think that we've emasculated male characters too much in some aspects. I think that male characters that feel attraction to female characters is completely fine. That does not bother me. It might be cringy at times. There are definitely moments where Dresden gets real cringy about it, but he's not the type of character that I'd be afraid to walk through a dark alley with, if that makes sense. He's pretty self-aware about it too, which I think is also a good sign of hopefully where the series is going to go, because I know from everybody that's told me about this that the first few books, like 1 through 4, have the most of that in there. But there was a line in this book specifically that kind of pulled away from the cringy objectification vibes to something that felt a little bit more gross and problematic. I know that there will be some of you in my audience that are like, Dory, why are you still reading this series? I am determined to get to the middle part of the Dresden Files. This is just because I am really curious. I like enough things about it that I want to see Butcher at his best in this series, because I'm very curious about it. And I know that the characters that I love are going to feature more and more and more through the series, which I look forward to, and Dresden as a character definitely moves away from that kind of dark, like, noir detective vibes that were necessary for marketing, I think, when this series was written. Don't agree with that necessarily, but I know why they're there. I just personally don't like it. So yeah, I don't know. We will see where this series goes. Again, there's some things about this that are just so intriguing. I laugh a lot. I really enjoy, the world building is so good. The characters are so good. I just look forward to hopefully less of the cringy content. Last but not least, I had such a good time with Thornhedge that I went to the library and I picked up a big stack of books, which I never do. This is like the biggest library haul I've had in probably years. And I picked up another T. Kingfisher, A House with Good Bones. This is about it's a very slice of life horror, which I'm really enjoying. And we follow Samantha Montgomery, who is a 32-year-old archaeoentomologist. So she studies bugs in archaeology digs, essentially, and categorizes bugs that are found, like remains of bugs and all sorts of things, and she is a nerd about it. Her very snarky but lovable narrative voice in this, I really enjoyed for the most part. There were definitely some subjective things that I had a problem with in this, but what I loved so much about this is the exploration of generational trauma in a way that does not feel like you go, oh, immediately, like, oh, yeah, okay, that's what we're talking about in this book. It was a story of growing up and feeling the weight, carrying the weight of previous generations on your shoulders and trying to break a cycle. And she does this all in a sort of southern horror setting where the house, I think, represents so much of that theme. It's so creepy. She does the horror so well without jumping into the deep end of it. It's creepy, it's terrifying. The end of this book gets really wild really fast, and I did feel like it was a little bit rushed after all of the buildup. But her character work and the way that she incorporates that horror into this kind of slice of life exploration of past history and the way you grow up in a house that feels heavy like this is so good. It's so good. There were some things about it, again, that I didn't love, but overall, I'm still thinking about this book, and I feel like T. Kingfisher is kind of 2 for 2 with me at this point in terms of her writing style. I'm really curious to see some of her other work, and yeah, her characters feel very realistic, very interesting, and I had a great time with this book. All right, guys, if I have to pick, this was a tough month to pick a book of the month, I'm not gonna lie, because there were several that I feel like I could have easily held up here. But the one that got the highest rating for me, the one that I think was a great introduction to a new author and just really did something unique and interesting with a subgenre that I don't typically reach for, I'm gonna give my book of the month to Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher, which honestly, I was not expecting when I picked this book up, when I set up my TBR for the month. This is not the book I expected to be on top, but here we are. I highly recommend this. I think it was the perfect short read. I think that T. Kingfisher has a really beautiful, unique voice. And I would highly recommend this to anybody that's looking for something about this size that's a fantasy retelling that I think actually deserves to be at the top of the list when it comes to fairy tale retellings. So that is my book of the month. I would love to know down in the comments below what books on this list you've read, which ones you're interested in, your experience with any of them. Tell me down in the comments, and I hope that you guys are having a phenomenal week. I hope that you are reading some 5-star reads, and I'll see you in the next video.